Somewhere right now, a child is being told not to lie. Maybe it's a parent in Lagos, or a grandmother in rural Okinawa, or a teacher in a classroom in São Paulo. Maybe the words are different. Maybe the reason given is different. Because God said so. Because karma will find you. Because it's simply not how we treat people. But the instruction is the same. Don't lie. Don't take what isn't yours. Don't hurt the people around you without cause. We pass this on so automatically, so unremarkably, that it barely registers as something that needs explaining. Of course you tell children not to lie. Of course you teach them to share. Of course you explain, in whatever language your particular community uses, that some things are wrong and some things are right. It's so familiar, it's almost invisible. But here's the thing worth noticing. The thing that surfaces when you look at it late at night with enough quiet around you to really sit with it. These instructions, don't steal, don't kill, don't lie, help those who need help, treat others the way you want to be treated, appear in nearly every major religious and moral tradition humanity has ever produced. Not as borrowings from one another, not always in direct contact, but as something that keeps arriving, independently, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. And the question that follows from that, the quiet one, the one that sounds harmless at first, is why? Before we keep going, if this kind of slow, unhurried thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos don't rush, they sit with things. And if you know someone who tends to think about this kind of question in the middle of the night, feel free to pass it along. All right, let's keep going. There's a story in the Mahabharata, the vast Sanskrit epic central to Hinduism, where the god Yudhishthira is asked what the greatest wonder of the world is. His answer, roughly translated, is this: every day, people see others die around them, and yet somehow believe it will never happen to them. The wonder is that we live as though we are permanent. There is a saying attributed to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Christian tradition: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In the Analects of Confucius, a text that forms the backbone of a system of ethics practiced across much of East Asia for over 2,000 years, there is a nearly identical phrase: what you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. In the Talmud, a student approaches the Rabbi Hillel and asks him to explain the entire Torah while standing on one foot. Hillel responds, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary." In the Hadith of the Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is recorded as saying that none of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. In the Buddhist tradition, this principle surfaces in discussions of compassion, the recognition that all beings wish to avoid suffering, and that this shared wish is the ground from which ethical behavior grows. These are not translations of one another. They arise from different languages, different centuries, different geographies, different theological frameworks, and yet they converge on something so similar that it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like something else, something worth turning over. Let's slow down a little here, because it's easy to list these things and feel like the list itself explains something. It doesn't. A list is just a list. The interesting part isn't the examples, it's the question underneath them. Why would this keep appearing? One answer, and you may have it already, depending on where you're standing, is that there is a source, a single moral reality that all of these traditions are pointing toward, however imperfectly, however differently. This is the intuition that animates a lot of religious thought, that these convergences aren't accidents, that they're echoes of something real, something outside human invention, something that human communities have been bumping into from different angles since the beginning. Another answer, standing at the opposite end of the spectrum, is evolutionary. The argument runs roughly like this: human beings are a social species. We survived in groups, groups that could maintain cooperation, that could share resources, manage conflict, restrain individual impulses that threatened collective functioning, outcompeted groups that couldn't. The moral intuitions that kept showing up are the ones that work, that keep a group together, and communities organize those intuitions into codes, stories, sacred laws, divine commands, whichever container made them most transmissible, most durable, most felt. Both of these answers are serious. Both of them have serious people behind them. And what's strange is that neither of them fully explains the feeling you get when you hold the examples side by side. The feeling isn't really explained by either theology or evolutionary biology. It's something closer to recognition, like noticing your own handwriting in a document you didn't write. There is a concept that some anthropologists and comparative religion scholars have returned to across the 20th century. The idea that beneath the enormous diversity of religious expression, there are structural similarities that are too consistent to be arbitrary. Mircea Eliade wrote extensively about the way sacred time and sacred space appear across cultures with remarkable regularity. Not the same gods, not the same stories, but the same sense that some places and some times are set apart, that the ordinary can be interrupted by something else. Joseph Campbell traced patterns he called monomyth across traditions and folk stories. A hero who leaves, is tested, transforms, returns. He was criticized for flattening too much, for finding similarities at the cost of differences. And those criticisms are fair, but the pattern he identified is there, even if his interpretation of it is contested. Rudolf Otto, a German theologian writing in the early 20th century, tried to describe what he called the numinous, a quality of experience that appears across religious traditions, which he described as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, mystery that is simultaneously terrifying and compelling, the sense of something encountered that is both overwhelming and irresistible. He found versions of this in the Hebrew Bible, in Islamic mysticism, in Hindu scripture, in the writings of Christian mystics. These scholars disagreed about what the pattern meant. They disagreed about whether the similarities pointed to a shared human psychology, or a shared divine reality, or simply a shared set of problems that human communities have always faced. But they kept returning to the pattern itself, because it was there and it wouldn't quite go away. There is a word in philosophy, and in some religious traditions, called the golden rule. It's used so often it's almost lost its texture. We say it the way we say phrases we've heard so many times they've stopped meaning anything. But when you try to really think about what it's asking, it becomes strange again. It's asking you to imagine yourself as the other person, to hold your own perspective and another's simultaneously. To make decisions not from your own position, but from a kind of averaged position, a place that includes both you and whoever you're about to affect. That's a remarkable cognitive and moral demand. And it's not obvious. It requires something that doesn't come automatically. Empathy is natural in some forms. We feel distress when we see distress. We share joy when we witness it. But the golden rule asks for something more deliberate, more reasoned, a kind of ethical discipline. And across all of these traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism, the Baha'i Faith, indigenous ethical frameworks from cultures that never encountered one another, this discipline keeps being named as central, not as one value among many, as something more fundamental than that, as something beneath the others holding them up. It's worth noticing that this might not be a coincidence about morality. It might be something about what morality has to be if it's going to function at all. Communities need cooperation. Cooperation requires some ability to consider the other's experience. The rule might appear everywhere, not because all traditions descended from a common source, but because any tradition that tried to hold a community together was going to have to locate something like this. Eventually, it's close to a precondition. But here's the part that stops that explanation from being complete. The rule doesn't just appear as a social mechanism. It appears wrapped in the deepest categories of meaning these traditions possess. It appears as divine command, as cosmic law, as the essence of enlightenment, as the foundation of righteousness. Not as a useful social technology, but as something the universe itself, in some sense, is organized around. And that gap between the functional explanation and the felt weight of the thing is the part that seems worth sitting with longest. The prohibitions keep rhyming too, across traditions separated by millennia and oceans. The 5 precepts of Buddhism: refrain from taking life, from taking what is not given, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, from intoxication that clouds the mind. The 10 Commandments in the Hebrew Bible, carried into both the Jewish and Christian traditions, Honor your parents. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. The 5 pillars of Islam include zakat, obligatory giving to those who need it. The tradition is filled with teachings about honesty, about the protection of life, about the treatment of the vulnerable. The yamas of Hindu ethics, described in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali: non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, continence, non-possessiveness. The Jain tradition takes ahimsa, non-violence, further than almost any other. It extends to all living beings, not just humans. The principle is the same, applied with radical consistency. You could spend a long time mapping these against each other and never quite finish. The categories aren't identical. The reasoning differs. The scope of who counts as a moral patient, who deserves consideration, varies enormously. What counts as violence? What counts as theft? What counts as honesty? What exceptions are permitted and on what grounds? All of this varies, sometimes dramatically. But the categories themselves keep appearing: don't harm, don't take, don't deceive, care for those who can't care for themselves. At some point, this stops feeling accidental. There is a harder version of this question, and it's worth not avoiding it, because it's easy to find the similarities and feel moved by them. Feel like they're pointing somewhere hopeful. Feel like they demonstrate something about human unity or divine consistency, or the common ground beneath our differences. And maybe they are. But the differences are also real, and they're also worth noticing. Religious traditions have disagreed, sometimes violently, about who the prohibitions apply to. Traditions that taught nonviolence sometimes sanctioned war under certain conditions. Traditions that taught love of neighbor defined neighbor in ways that excluded many people who were, in plain observation, also neighbors. The history of religious ethics is not just a history of convergence. It is a history of who gets included in the circle of moral concern, and how that circle was drawn and redrawn, and who drew it, and what it cost to be outside it. The shared moral language and the shared moral failures are not separate stories, they're the same one. And yet, the people who pushed the circle outward, who insisted it be drawn more widely, who challenged their own tradition's exclusions, they often did so using the tradition's own most central values. Abolitionists in the Christian tradition cited the image of God in all people. Reformers in Islamic jurisprudence cited the Prophet's teachings on human dignity. Figures like B.R. Ambedkar, who converted from Hinduism to Buddhism, did so in part because he found in Buddhist teaching a framework for equality that he felt Hinduism in practice had denied. The values in the reform movements both came from inside the same traditions, which raises a question about the values themselves: where they live, what they're attached to, how durable they are across the changes and failures and renewals of the traditions that carry them. There is a writer named Karen Armstrong who has spent much of her career exploring the commonalities across the world's major religions. In her book, The Great Transformation, she traces the period roughly between 900 and 200 BCE, what the philosopher Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, during which, in China, India, the Middle East, and Greece, a new kind of ethical and spiritual thinking emerged, apparently independently, more or less simultaneously. Confucius, the Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Upanishadic thinkers, all of them within a few centuries of each other, with no documented contact, began asking similar questions about the relationship between the individual and the cosmos, about the nature of suffering, about what it meant to live well. Armstrong's argument, and she holds it carefully, is that these traditions were responding to similar crises: rapid social change, the emergence of new economies, violence and instability. The old mythologies weren't holding, and in that rupture a new ethical sensibility emerged, something more interior, more universal, more concerned with the inner life and less with purely external ritual. Whether the timing is coincidence or not is genuinely unclear. Historians debate it, but the pattern is there, and it keeps asking the same question that all the other patterns ask. What does it mean that this keeps happening? Maybe the purpose wasn't entirely what we assumed. We tend to think of religious moral teaching as derivative, as a set of rules someone wrote down, attached to divine authority, and then distributed to populations who would follow them more reliably if they believed God was watching. That's a familiar story about religion and ethics, and there's something to it. But the traditions themselves don't describe it that way. They describe something more like discovery, like coming upon something that was already there. The Buddha doesn't present the precepts as his own invention. The Torah is given, not generated. The Quran is revealed. The Analects are attributed to a sage who claimed to be transmitting something received, not created. Even secular moral philosophers like Kant arrive at something like the Golden Rule through pure reason and present it not as a preference, but as a categorical imperative, a constraint built into the structure of rational thought itself. What's strange isn't that humans invented similar moral codes. What's strange is how consistently the people transmitting these codes insisted they weren't inventing anything, that they were pointing at something. Whether that something is divine reality, evolved social wisdom, a structural feature of rational ethics, or something that doesn't yet have a name, that part remains genuinely open. And so we return to the child being told not to lie, in Lagos, in Okinawa, in São Paulo. In 10,000 other places the child will never visit, where other children are being told the same thing in languages they will never learn. The instruction moves through time the way certain shapes move through nature, appearing in unconnected places as if the world has a preference for it. As if the underlying logic of living together keeps arriving at the same conclusions from different starting points, in different vocabularies, through different visions of what the universe is and what we owe each other inside it. You could explain that. There are several explanations available. Some of them are compelling, some of them are even beautiful. But there's something that sits just underneath the explanations, a kind of pressure in the pattern that doesn't fully resolve when you apply any of them. The feeling of recognition remains, the sense that whatever this is, it was here before we named it, and will be here after any particular name for it fades. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe it's just what convergence looks like from the inside. Or maybe it's worth sitting with just a little longer, because the question it leaves is not really about religion or ethics or history. It's a quieter question. It's the question of what it means to keep arriving at the same place, when you were never told where to go, and you had no map, and no one was traveling with you. What are we walking toward? And why do so many paths seem to lead there? If this brought something up for you, not a conclusion, just a feeling, or a question you hadn't had before, you're welcome to leave it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and I find what people notice in these videos as interesting as the videos themselves. If you'd like more of this kind of slow, unhurried thinking, on belief, on ritual, on the patterns that keep returning, subscribing to Belief Explained simply means you won't miss the next one. And if someone in your life tends to turn these kinds of questions over late at night, this might be something worth passing along to them. Thank you for spending this time here. That's not a small thing.